This book explores a central puzzle about the role of aspirations and planning in young people's attainment. High aspirations and planning are thought to be key drivers in young people's attainment, and this has been true in terms of how we think about status attainment for a really long time. But aspirations have grown markedly more ambitious, and still we see the replication of social class background, and more young people, to the working class and poor young people, are not, even if they have high aspirations, they're not getting the status that they aspire towards. So this book looks at the role of plans for the future in shaping young women's early attainment and transition to adulthood. And I look at class, race, and gender. Most of my focus today is going to be on class. You'll see the other stuff coming as well. So the idea behind the status attainment model is that parents' occupational and educational attainment is related to their children's attainment, and that much of this association is explained by parents and teachers' encouragement to go to college and peers' college plans, then affecting young people's own aspirations. That's what the significant others influences: their parents, their teachers, their peers. And put simply, this model suggests that young people who grow up in higher status families aspire towards higher status goals, and young people who grow up in lower status families aspire towards lower status goals, and that these aspirations become plans leading young people to replicate their parents' social class status. And this has been a driving force in a lot of research on aspirations over many decades. Some of the more notable work: Willis is Learning to Labor, and McLeod's Ain't No Making It. Willis looked at the lads in England, showing that their rejection of schooling explained their replication of their own working class status. And McLeod's Hallway Hangers, who were white working class young men, also rejected schooling to their detriment. He found that the brothers, who were black working class young men, held high aspirations, and so their low aspirations weren't necessarily explaining why they still fell short, but they all still fell short. Both work shows how aspirations are structured by class background, and McLeod brings in the importance of race as well. But both fall short when trying to explain outcomes among young people who are highly ambitious and yet fall short. And they also focus on young men to the exclusion of young women. And the status attainment model did as well. When it was first conceptualized, it was all about father's occupation and education, son's outcomes as well. It did expand from there. Not long after McLeod's work, a lot of the concern flipped from are young people not ambitious enough to are they too ambitious? And that's the problem. There's a lot of flip-flopping on this. So Seidel's book was written in 1990, and she looked at whether young women in particular were, they dreamed of the house on the hill. They wanted to be financially independent on their own, but she argued that they weren't aware of the need for dual incomes and their role in family life, and that they would sort of face disappointment down the road. Mickelson observed that Black young people had higher aspirations than white young people, but that these aspirations tended to be more abstract in the sense that they believed in the power of education. They believed it was important more so than white adolescents. But they didn't have the concrete aspirations, the belief that education would work for them, because the adults they saw around them, education hadn't necessarily worked for them, right? So they saw that as a model. Shedder and Stevenson argued that young people, in particular, this is a lovely quintessential Gen X photo of young people. The young people were ambitious in their occupational plans, but they didn't know the amount of education they needed to fulfill those occupational plans. And so they either aspired to too much education or too little, but either way, that mismatch, so what they called, they said what was important was aligned aspirations. So what was misaligned or unmatched aspirations were failing young people, and that's why they weren't attaining their goals. This also relates to psychological research on planful competence, this idea that young people have to be motivated, be practical, be able to evaluate their own ability and evaluate what's out there and plan for the future. And then they will, if they're persistent and they plan well, they'll attain what they, sorry, what's that expected? Planful competence. Yeah. It's a social psychological John Clausen is the. Yeah. So going a little bit old school, but what I've what I argue in looking at a lot of this prior work is that both the status attainment model and a lot of research on aspirations tend to take aspirations and plan as unidimensional, higher or lower, or even if it's mismatched, right? It's just this sort of very broad strokes idea of what plans for the future are without looking into the context surrounding their development and pursuit. And this lends too much power to individual agency and too little to how structures, both schema and resources, shape the status attainment process. This doesn't mean that we need to ignore individual actions, but by uncovering the structures that enable some actions and constrain others, we can see the full extent of young people's agency. It's possible in particular to be planful, to put in the work needed to plan for the future and still not have all the right information or resources needed to put those plans in motion. Young women's plans in particular for the future are molded by the world as it is and the world as they see it. They may hold high aspirations to go to college and graduate school, eventually obtaining a professional degree or a professional job, but they must also grapple with where to go to college, how to fund college, right? And if those resources aren't there, if they aren't getting the right information, they're still going to fall short. And gathering this information, constructing and enacting these plans requires substantial resources. Their pursuit of these goals too depends both on their own persistence and the degree to which institutions reward, deter, or even punish persistence. So part of what I argue is actually that high aspirations can set some young people into a treadmill that actually exploits them rather than benefits them. In addition to this, status attainment model and other frameworks don't usually consider how goals for family life or leisure might influence educational and occupational paths and aspirations. And this is a particularly important consideration for young women whose family goals have long been seen as interfering with attainment, if not shaping earlier goals. And then the life course perspective suggests that larger context matter as well. So there's an emphasis on trajectories and cumulative advantages and disadvantages, that we're not just looking at here's your plans, here's your outcomes, but what happens in between. The importance of linked lives, meaning the trajectories of other people's lives close to adolescence, and then the historical context as well. In particular, I interviewed young women who were graduating high school during the Great Recession. There were near universal aspirations for college in general, and still are among young people today. Increasing student loan debt. Some of the policy implications of my book have been shortened by Biden. Thank you, Biden. The rise of precarious work, difficulty getting hours, and then changes in attitudes towards gender, family, and work. These things all matter when thinking about how young people plan for the future and how they attain their goals. So I grapple sort of broadly with how do social ties inform young women's paths for schoolwork and family life, and how does this vary by social class and race? And then how do we see, and why do we see similar plans pay off differentially by social class and race in the transition to adulthood? So I initially interviewed junior and senior high school girls at two high schools. One was sort of more working class, one more middle class, although there was diversity in class background in both. This is in 2008. I re-interviewed them again 5 to 6 years later in 2013, 2014, about 2/3 of them. I selected young women who were interested in health careers, particularly because those careers are very sort of heavily regulated. You need specific degrees for them. So I was able to really assess the realisticness of their plans rather than business, sports, acting, things that don't necessarily have one pathway towards them. And it also allowed me to look at similar aspirations that were at different levels of education requirements. Tried as much as possible to balance by race. Where I was primarily Black and white young people, so that's primarily who I interviewed. Balanced by ambitiousness and specificity of their aspirations, and when possible by high school track, and we could figure that out. And so the surveys asked them what occupation they wanted to hold in the future, as well as asked them if they didn't know, or if they just were sort of vaguely interested in certain areas. I had a list of different fields, including health, that they could check off. So some people had, obstetrician, right? Very specific, versus saying like, I'm interested in health generally. And that got me pretty good range of class background. At the second high school where I interviewed, I knew their track based on their class schedules. The first one I didn't. So as I mentioned, they were ages 16 to 18 in 2008, and then 21 to 24 in the second wave. And interviews generally lasted about an hour to 2.5 hours.
And real quick, they were the same students or same folks. You were able to go back to them?
Yes, yeah, same ones.
And do you know why you lost 20? Like, were you able to?
Somewhat. I only ever had one person say that they couldn't do it. They didn't have time. Otherwise, it was more drop off among the poor and working class kids whose I had asked them for their phone numbers, their addresses, contact information for 2 adults that they were close to. So, but when they move more often and they're not necessarily tied to a college, because I could sometimes find them if they were tied to a college, then I had more trouble finding them. So yeah, it was a lot. Or family rifts where like the person I had was no longer speaking to the young person, and then their own cell phone had been.
But 21 is pretty good, actually.
Yeah.
But it's like, at that age, yeah.
And shouldn't the second age group be 2 years, like, shouldn't it be the same as the other one?
No, because it was 13 to 14, like it was a 2-year period where I interviewed them in the fall of 2008, but then some of them I interviewed like about 5 years later and some about 6 years later. So that's why it's the one thing.
Can we let the speaker finish before interrupting her?
Yes, let's do that.
Oh, just my for no questions. I don't mind either way. Clarifying is fine, but yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so this is my sample. I had 25 middle class young people and 36 working class or poor. I think I didn't say this just very quickly about the sort of how I determined this. So the middle class young people had at least one parent in white collar managerial professional occupations and had attended and usually completed college. I actually initially separated them to upper middle class and middle class, but that distinction didn't matter that much. Working class kids had parents who were high school graduates or had attended college or technical school, but not necessarily gotten a BA, and worked in blue collar or service jobs. Most were employed, almost all were employed. Whereas the poor young people, most parents were unemployed and over half had not completed high school, and the rest were high school graduates. I didn't ask income. I didn't expect young people to know their parents' income. So because I focus more on education and occupation, there are some working class families that are a little bit more stable than middle class families, right? There's some diversity there in terms of economic resources. But I did find that the way that they had access to social ties in particular cleaved along these dimensions pretty well. So Black biracial, some young women self-identified as both Black and white because they had one parent that was white. They usually didn't use biracial as a term, so that's just sort of my shorthand. So there were 19 Black or biracial. There were 39 who were white. There were 3 who were Latino or biracial. It was just one who was white and Mexican, essentially identified, and the other 2 were, one was Mexican and one was Cuban. It's not a big immigrant destination where I interviewed, and this was in the Midwest. So you can see family structure changes a lot depending on middle class status or working class status. Certainly more of middle class live with biological parents. And educational and occupational aspirations were higher for middle class young people than working class and poor, but not hugely so. Almost all of them aspired to go to college of some kind, even if they had sort of different levels, usually vague or undecided. It's less that they didn't know and more that they had different aspirations and what hadn't decided in particular. Maybe one of them, they weren't sure what level of education they would need. Time. Okay. So I have analyzed this data over time in many different ways. I've used Atlas, Deduce, by hand, Word, Excel, and so on. Magic. I use an iterative coding process. In particular, as I got further along, I used profiles for each of the girls. So once I had my sort of major themes established, what I needed to look at a glance, I have a one Word document for each of them that sort of summarizes each one and has major quotes. And then I also used output into Excel and organized to look at the data more holistically. And what I ended up doing was grouping the middle class together, as well as working class and poor together for most of the analysis. All right. So my key arguments for the book, the process of planning for the future is shaped by structural opportunities and constraints that differ by social class and race. I also argue that that process of how to plan can be transposed into new settings. So when they go on, when they graduate from high school, they go into college and so on, they have learned the process of how to plan for the future one way or another, and they transpose that into new settings. The educational landscape creates pitfalls for working class and for young women that exploit their high aspirations, in particular in the form of high loans. The deregulation of the labor market affects young women through their own work, but also through that of their families. And this is particularly important for young women who are expected to pitch in with their families when parents had to work, and there needed to still be household responsibilities taken care of. And then as far as we can see, upward and downward mobility in the early transition to adulthood, those who were mobile experienced hybrid pathways that were sort of like the main group, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but different because of the class that they were coming from. All right, so the way that the book is structured is that I look at first the girls' experience in high school in part 1, and then where they ended up in part 2. I'm gonna go a little bit more quickly on part 1, partially because I've written about it and presented about it more often, and then we can get to hopefully the interesting stuff in part 2. And hopefully it's all interesting, but interesting to me at the moment. All right, so generally, okay. What I found overall for high school girls' plans for the future was that they were strikingly similar in the way I talked about that. When I asked them what they wanted their life to look like when they were age 30, for example, Kathleen, who's middle class and Black, said, I want to own my own home, I guess be married, and since I want 4 kids, I want my kids after I get out of school and after I do my medical internship. Bethany, who is working class and white, said, I'm going to be out of school, I'm going to have a good career, maybe be married, maybe I'll have kids for a job. They generally talked about their career, having kids, being married, owning a home. These were not that different, and nor were their plans in broad strokes, right? They had aligned aspirations, they knew how much education they needed for the careers that they wanted. There was some difference in anticipated timing, particularly white working class girls anticipated starting work, finishing school, and moving in with their significant other a little bit earlier than working class poor and then Black middle class and poor girls, and then all middle class girls. Black girls anticipated finishing school, marriage, and home buying happening a little bit later within each social class. So slight differences, but nothing. Where I did find differences is more in the details of these plans. So middle class girls anticipated a package future. When I talk about package future, I mean that they're looking at all of occupation, education, and family, and that they consider family goals as part of this future, as well as the fact that middle class girls knew what it looked like to be in a middle class family setting. You know, any of the girls wanted a middle class future, right? This is American dream. They wanted that stability. But the middle class girls were able to just transpose what they had around them to what they could see in the future, what they anticipated. It would look like what their current lives look like. They also had much more information through the social ties that they had, people informing them of what those futures could look like. So for example, Janice, who is the middle class and biracial, when I asked her about her intentions for her career and schooling, said, I'm going to college to major in psychology, and I'm going to get a Psi D degree, which is kind of like a PhD, except it's less research oriented. It's more like the practical application of psychology, right? They had a lot of detailed information from their social ties. And this is really the social capital and the production and future plans piece of it. The adults they knew, particularly for white middle class young women, reached out to them, said, what do you want to do? How can I help? Got them set up with shadowing opportunities, right? Really made an effort to help them. And so that informed their plans and also provided them with certain resources that they could later show, college applications and so on. In addition, I found that middle class young women were influenced in their aspirations, and this is particularly among white middle class, but both, being encouraged to think about family life. Only one of them said this directly. So she said when she wanted to be a lawyer, her mother said, well, think about it. You can't be, because my dad wants me to be a lawyer because he's a lawyer. But she goes, now, Jocelyn, you realize he's gone from 5 to 5. Implying basically you can't have a family and be a lawyer. And she even told me that wasn't true, but she still agreed with her mother and decided to look into pharmacy. That usually didn't happen directly. It usually happened through, they would talk to women in particular. So their mother's friends, their mothers, things like that, their aunts. And those women would say, yeah, like think about pharmacy. It's flexible. You can go down to part-time when you need to. You can craft your hours. So that's sort of how they were pushed towards more female-dominated occupations, was through this idea of like, you want a flexible job. Even if these jobs were not always flexible. What they thought were flexible and what are flexible may not always align. In addition to this, so most of the girls thought that they would probably take some time off to have children or go down to part-time work, but they all wanted to show that they had career and financial stability first as a manifestation of independence. So for example, Gail, who's middle class and white, said after I'm out of college, I want to earn enough money to really support me and my family. Pretty much ever since I remember, I've wanted to be a more independent person. So even though she anticipated scaling back hours when she was at work, she wanted to show that she was independent first, before getting married and having children. I found differences in access to and mobilization of social ties by race. The middle class Black girls had fewer social ties to professionals. In addition to that, they just weren't approached by adults asking them what they were interested in, particularly when they appeared to, when those professionals were white. Like I didn't encounter those, I didn't observe those interactions, but from what I could tell in terms of who they said approached them with advice and so on, it seemed to break down by race. And so they just had a harder time knowing what particular occupations looked like. They were very well planned for college, and their parent in particular were very, very heavily involved. But things like Jordan, whose mother was a pharmacist, only knew about her mother's work in a drugstore. She didn't know about the other possible avenues of pharmacy. Whereas Gail, who was interested in being a pharmacist, knew about, like, you could be a pharmacist in a hospital, a community setting with an insurance company, right? She just had more information through her social ties. And I'll talk about unstable lives for working class. Basically, middle class homes were fairly stable. So working class young people, they hoped for a repackaged future. And what this means is that they sort of looked at what the middle class looked like from the outside. And so they were kind of piecing together what they wanted in the future from what they didn't want in their own family lives, as well as what they saw on TV and among people that, at school or things like that, they saw as middle class. So when I asked Courtney, who encouraged you to go to college, and Courtney was a white working class young woman, so my dad and my granny, the economy too. I look up to my managers and the older people I work with, and I don't want to be here for the rest of my life. I want to be able to afford nice things and not be strapped down like my dad, and not have to work crazy hours like my dad. I just want to have a nice set job and make good money. All right, and then for working class and white young women, they also wanted financial independence, but rather than seeing it as a manifestation of independence, they saw it as a bulwark against risk, that marriage was a risky proposition, and therefore they wanted to make sure that they were financially independent before marriage. Blake, who's poor and white, said you hear about how they'll go to college, meaning young women, and they meet this this guy the first year of college, they get married, and then, you know, later they get divorced and they can't support themselves because they didn't finish college. So the fear of sort of being left and not financially stable. I also found that for working class and for young women, their social capital often was through reciprocal ties. I mean, they were supporting their family members as much as getting support. Sometimes this was just emotional. They talked about their days, but it was much less unidirectional, helping them, than it was these kinds of exchanges. Sandra, who I interviewed, who was poor, her mother was disabled. She took a half day of high school classes and left early so she could go home, clean the house, and then go to work. She and her family lived with her cousins because they were helping her aunt out. Her aunt had a lot of medical issues and they were helping raise the cousins. They also helped take care of her brother's children. And she was helped, her grandmother helped her understand medical terminology when she had a health scare. And her grandmother also told her she was going to help her find scholarships to college, but she said, my grandmother's always working and we can't just find time to sit down. So there was a lot of help, but it often was around immediate concerns. This happened in school as well, particularly because more working class and poor young women had residential and family instability. A lot of the time with guidance counselors was focused on just the bureaucratic nature of making sure they were on track, getting them classes if they had left the school for periods of time. Bernice, for example, who's poor and Black, had a lot of household instability. She and her family lost their house when she was in the 9th grade, and then in different years and just periods of months had to live with different members of family, friends, things like that in different configurations because they didn't have a stable home. All right, so in the end, what I found was that there were reasonable and ambitious plans across social classes, but there was a great deal of difference in the information they had, as well as sort of the resources they had to really get ready for college and to plan for college. Then I want to know how would this matter? So broadly, this is what I found in terms of where the girls ended up. These are their social classes. On track, holding on, and navigating routes were roughly analogous to this. It's just where they were in their early 20s, right? On track, they were in college full time, generally residential colleges, doing well, either following the goals they had in high school or slightly amended. Holding on girls are trying to sort of particularly do schooling and work at the same time, but also supporting families sometimes, and then navigating RUTCs. Often those young women had kids themselves, often weren't working steadily or in school that way. So what you can see is a lot of class replication. There's also a fair amount of mobility, but particularly downward mobility. None of the poor girls ended up on track. Some working class girls did. Middle class girls, although most of them ended up on track, there was a not insignificant number that ended up holding on or navigating rough seas. So being on track refers to two qualities. First, that in young adulthood, young women were moving steadily towards a career that would likely garner them middle class status. And second, that they were guided and moved along by institutional structures or tracks that eased their way. Good playing in high school aided them, but also economic stability and institutional and social ties really mattered. So, for example, Jordan, who was middle class and Black, she was admitted into a small selective Catholic school near her sister. Actually, these were two of the kids that I actually interviewed sisters without knowing it at first. She excelled in college. She was in an honors program. She was in many different organizations, particularly for students of color, a Black sorority, a Black student association, accounting association for Black students, college club for women of color, and an organization that facilitated business internships for students of color. She had two academic advisors, one for honors and one for a major, and a mentor through the mentoring program, who in particular advised her on sort of the cultural capital of the business world, right? In particular, she told me this mentor told her that filet mignon is not just undercooked hamburger, and you have to learn how to appreciate it. Right? These are the kinds of examples that she gave. But these helped a lot, and so did the internships. And so she was able to assess the difference between private accounting and public accounting, and decided that like she would prefer to go into private accounting. And she did. She eventually did go. She works in New York City, actually, or she worked in New York City. I don't know if she still is, but she did succeed in the financial track. What, for Jordan and for others, what really mattered for many of them were these institutional ties. Colleges are tracked. And we think about tracks for high school, but colleges are tracked too. They have honors programs, they have these internal programs that you have to apply to. And 8 of the 14 young women were in these professional or specialized programs. And this really, really helped them both get social ties while they were in college for planning, help them if they had any dips in grades, got them prepared, got them study groups, things like that. The remainder majored in liberal arts, but had productive ties with mentors. So this personalized advising, information sharing, and contact with professionals really mattered for their journey through college. There were some differences between working class and middle class girls who were on track. Generally in that parents weren't a huge presence in their experience in college, but certainly there was more financial support for middle class girls. And so working class girls sometimes had to take time off to work. And parental support when things went awry was certainly more common for middle class girls. All right. The holding on young women were working furiously to stay in place. They struggled to balance multiple domains in their life, their school, work, and family while chasing the American dream. Jenny, for example, was actually a poor young woman who ended up holding on, which is a huge accomplishment. Her mother and stepfather generally alternated between working at the steel factory and cleaning slab furnaces in unemployment when she was growing up. She managed to graduate from high school, none of her family members had, and was attending college. But she had a rough road. Her mother hoarded cats. She said her mother had like 30 or 40 cats. And so at the end of high school, she started staying with friends just to get out of the house. They were close, but she couldn't deal with the housing situation. And then moved in with a boyfriend after a few weeks of dating. She delayed college initially, but worked 50 hours a week as a pizza chain manager, earning $900 every 2 weeks. And then eventually enrolled in a local college. She felt alienated at her first college and then transferred somewhere closer to home. And she moved jobs several times to try to find jobs that would accommodate her school schedule. A Pell Grant and work covered most of her tuition. Then she took out a loan of $1,000 to cover the rest each semester. Her boyfriend was also paying off $16,000 in loans from a for-profit university. And she wanted to go into the business program that was housed at the main campus. She was at a branch campus, but the tuition would increase. So what she found from her advisor was that if you could continue to take more of your classes at the branch campus, that would be the tuition you'd pay, even if you took classes at the main campus. So that was the balance she was trying to keep in order to not have her tuition go up. And this was not, dissimilar. Jenny was doing very well in comparison to a lot of these young women. About half worked full-time or more than full-time, and the rest worked intensive part-time while enrolled in college. They earned very low money. They took out loans. And half were enrolled when I talked to them, but all but 2 spent time enrolled in college.
Just a technical matter.
Yeah.
I think I saw somebody in the waiting room.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, you've got it. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. And what was I gonna say? I think that was the next one. All right, so all of them were trying to finish a college degree or had completed a college degree, but only one was working in the area where that degree was attained. There were associate's degrees and technical degrees that they had attained, but they weren't able to actually find work in that. They also had difficulty at completing degrees due to the weakness of the higher education landscape, difficulty transitioning to college level work, a lack of institutional support, and diversionary practices. So what I mean by this is, so many of them were trying to get into programs things like nursing, and they have long wait lists in a lot of places, and so they weren't able to get in, and they were just kind of holding steady in college classes while waiting for that wait list to happen. Or they were placed in remedial education, even those who had gotten good grades in high school, and they were taking classes that weren't moving towards their major and kind of treading water in these circumstances. Jennifer, for example, was working class Black young woman, kept trying to go to college, but every time she would enroll in a college, get A's and B's in the first semester, then have failing grades the second semester. The first time, because she was living with her aunt had an alcohol problem, and so when her alcoholism kind of cropped up again, Jennifer was distracted. The second time, because the car that she was using broke down and she didn't have the money for another car. So she now owed $10,000 in college loans and was still working as a home health aide, 65 hours a week without getting a degree. She still wanted to go back to college, but said, well, I've been thinking about going back and getting certified in business management first, and hopefully from there I can go back and get an associate's degree and then a bachelor's degree. So she was thinking, okay, I can do this piecemeal and not fail out of these programs. That's a lot more loans and no guarantee of a job that will help her pay off those loans. So many of them were still trying to get through, but kept shifting their plans, hoping to find the right combination of a degree that would get them a job that they needed. And this was created a real cost in loans over time. The other thing that was important for them and for those who were navigating rough seas is that educational loans are very hard to defer. And one of the ways you can defer them is by going back to school, right? So one of the young women I interviewed, and I think she was from the Navigating Rough Seas group, but she had loans of money to $30,000 and those were about to come due in monthly payments. She couldn't afford them, so she was thinking about going back to school to try to get a nursing degree for $37,000, right? That would allow her to defer. There were also differences in the experience of being holding on if you were coming from the middle class versus for working class families. Middle class women who were in the holding on group experienced a soft landing into holding on rather than falling all the way to navigating rough seas. After sometimes getting in legal trouble, abusing drugs, things like that they would sort of end up in that middle group rather than necessarily ending up in rough seas. And these young women also blamed themselves for where they were. So Holly, who was juggling classes and working nearly full time while dealing with her father's oxycodone addiction, her grandmother's dementia, and the death of 2 friends by suicide, described herself as lazy and not a planner, right? So they really blame themselves for where they were rather than looking at these structural constraints. The last group was navigating rough seas. So Britt, who was poor and white, was a good example of that. Britt was one of my favorite people to talk to. She was very savvy. She was a straight A student in high school. And her number one goal was getting out of her home. When I interviewed her in high school, she lived with her mother who had lost her job working as a secretary for a trucking company, her grandmother, and then many other uncles, cousins, and so on who kind of came in and out of the house. She told me a story in high school where she one day came down, she lived in a room in the basement next to her uncle, who at the time when I interviewed her was in prison, but was planning to move back in once he got out. And she went to go change in her room and looked and turned around and realized that there was a man sleeping in her bed who was a friend of her uncle's. So after that Christmas, her Christmas present was a safe to keep her valuables so that nobody could take it or interfere with her things. Unfortunately, so Britt graduated early, but after her grandmother died, shortly after she graduated, they lost the house. And so she and her mother moved in the trailer with her boyfriend and his mom. And they lived there for about 6 months with him. But then she and her mom were kicked out when she found out her boyfriend was cheating and she broke up with him. They eventually found new housing. And I went to interview them, or her in her new place. And she was still living with her mother and then with her sister, who was under house arrest. Her sister's boyfriend had been arrested in a drug sting, and then her own son and her sister's 2 kids who she was taking care of. Her sister was very clearly high when I was there interviewing and actually died of an overdose not long after. Britt tried. She tried to enroll in college, but she was plagued with anxiety over driving. She completed an unaccredited dental assisting course and then tried to apply for jobs with that certificate, but couldn't get any. She had her son and had a lot of health problems associated with being pregnant and then after, and was still breastfeeding when I talked to her and planning to go back to work. But she'd really only worked seasonal, well, once at a home as a home health aide, and then otherwise seasonally at a haunted house doing makeup, and that was like sort of her main work experience. Young women like Britt and those who are navigating RCs are often referred to as disconnected youth because they're not attached to an educational institution or work. But it's not a very good name for them or way to think about them. First of all, because they're going in and out of schooling, in and out of work, and really trying to establish those ties. In addition to the fact that they have ties to family and they're doing work for their families, often taking care of not only of their own children, but the children of family members. And so that work becomes devalued when we think about them as disconnected. So the most common educational factor for these young women is they did enroll in college after high school, but dropped out over a short period of time. Sometimes academic troubles and failing classes, sometimes bureaucratic hurdles. I found just like Professor Young and Cotton that they sometimes would struggle with trying to get enrolled in a nonprofit college, and would find that for-profit college is much easier. They would handle the sort of bureaucratic process of that. So they get enrolled there, but those institutions cost a lot more money. And they accrued a lot of loans in this process, both from the for-profit and not-for-profit colleges. This is also what Stephanie DeLuca calls educational traps, right? That they get caught up in places where they end up with degrees but can't find work. So 3 of these young women completed short-term degrees, such as post-secondary certificates, but didn't find work from these. They also worked in low-wage jobs with a lot of precarity, and so a few of the young people were let go at different times from the jobs that they were holding. They had close family ties and a lot of reciprocity, but that also created opportunities for conflict. So there was a lot of infighting among families that they reported. And a lot of the young women had serious setbacks, mental health problems, drug abuse, problems with the law that also put them into navigating rough seas. And in the end, a lot of them became fairly fatalistic. They still had goals and they still wanted to go to college, wanted to complete their education. But they also had encountered these structural barriers that seemed to come out of nowhere, like things that happened that just they didn't have any control of. And so they, in turn, talked about the future as either sort of unpredictable. So one of them said, I asked her what she wanted to happen, at age 30, and she said, wherever the wind freaking takes me, right? Like, just sort of like, I'll do whatever comes around. Many of them said, put it in God's hands. So there was a little bit of a religious aspect to that, as well as sort of, let's see what happens, fatalism. Okay, so from all of this, plans for the future were forged through social networks in ways that were stratified by class and race. I also found that college students are tracked, and I think this has a lot of implications for how successful colleges are in graduating young people and young people getting jobs. I don't argue that we need more tracks. I argue that we need the resources that those tracks have for all college students. That the deregulation of educational institutions and the labor market, coupled with these high aspirations, create pitfalls for young people. They accrue these loans and get in this sort of in and out status with colleges. I didn't mention a lot of the holding on girls in particular switch colleges and programs multiple times, doing this college, trying to find the right fit. Social class mobility shapes young women's experiences in the transition to adulthood. And then I didn't talk as much about the gender, but gender shapes aspirations and pathways differentially by social class as well. I argue that how young people plan for the future is important, but not always in the ways that we think. It shows us the importance of these structural opportunities and constraints and the importance of social capital. I don't think it's a matter of just saying, let's help kids plan better when there are barriers to them actually fulfilling these goals. We have to make those goals attainable. I also argue that the experience of planning generates schemas that are transposable in other settings. And so those middle class young people benefit not only from the experience of planning when they're in high school, but then also taking that and planning in a similar fashion when they're in college. And these differences create opportunities for some, but exploitation for others. These high aspirations also create exploitation for working class and for young people. And I agree that what we see in these tracks in college is an example of effectively maintained inequality. So Samuel Lucas argued that as any level of education becomes more universal, you start to see differentiation. So you have effectively maintained inequality because all college degrees are not going to be the same, and therefore there's going to be this horizontal stratification in addition to vertical. Thanks.